without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over. Today we have Dr. Molly Barari, who I've worked with in the past, and I'm really excited to have her here to talk a little bit about writing our genealogy down and how to make it an interesting, complete story. So I'll just shut up.
So do we all have an area where we can actually do some writing? Is everyone here willing to do a little writing today?
I brought some paper too, if anybody.
So make sure that you have access to a surface you can write on. So if some of you want to move up.
Right.
Yeah, we're not going to do a ton of writing, but we'll do a little bit. Okay, well, thanks for being here today. As Mark said, I'm Molly Barari, and I am a South Dakota Humanities Council Scholar, and that is the venue for how I provide this program is through the South Dakota Humanities Council. So we want to take a minute and give them just a quick shout out. Thanks Humanities Council for letting us do these programs. And thank you to the Meade County Historical Society for having me. Today's program is going to focus on writing about an ancestor. So writing about an ancestor, or ancestors, right? Because we have more than one. So how do we write about those people in our past? How do we write about those relatives in our life story? How do we write about the people and the places that came before us? That is going to be the topic of today's workshop. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what is an ancestor? If you had to define it, what is an ancestor? How would you define it? And come on in. This is Colleen. She's taken some of my workshops before.
Hello,
So
please join us.
come on in, Colleen.
Good day.
An ancestor could be your family or somebody that was important in your life in the past, in my opinion.
Someone in the past, right?
Yeah.
In your family line. And any other ideas for what an ancestor could be? How you define it?
I define it as the family that came before you.
Yeah, the family that came before you. All of these are correct, by the way. So Merriam-Webster says that an ancestor is one from whom a person is descended and who is usually more remote in the line of descent than a grandparent. So it's usually a little more remote than that. But for today's purposes, I think we could really write about anyone who came before you. And think about anyone who came before you, because it's all part of our genealogy. So just to get a quick summary so far of what you already do, what are some of your favorite research methods for finding out about your ancestors? Does anyone have any favorite research methods for how you found things out about your ancestors? Yes.
Newspapers.com, it came off of the Ancestry site, I think.
Yeah, it's all by ancestors.
Yeah, and it's a pretty good.
I've heard that one's good.
It's great, yeah.
Yeah, so newspapers.com.
The Library of Congress also has a newspaper database.
Okay.
It's really extensive as well.
So we have newspapers.com, we have Library of Congress website. Any other ones that are your go-tos?
Local newspapers.
Local newspapers,
You know, microfilm and stuff.
the microfilm.
The one I enjoyed the most was talking with an older ancestor.
Ooh, that's a good
An older
one.
relative.
I don't think we can ever underestimate that. Talking to people. Anyone who's still living, who has those memories. I think that's the best source, those primary sources. People who are actually there in that time and place. People who lived through some of those things. That's why it's so important to talk to our veterans while they're still here, to talk to any of our older relatives even if maybe they're starting to lose their memories a little bit, there's still pieces of truth that they still have.
Veterans pension records are amazing too.
Veterans pension records?
Yes, because they're usually requesting a pension and it has to explain how they got injured and stuff. And then if it's a widow's pension, they have to bring in affidavits from people that were with them
Uh-huh.
to talk about what they experienced and stuff and how they might have gotten injured or whatever. It's like Civil War or something, so
That's-
there's some great stuff there.
What is it called, the veterans pension, what?
Veterans pension records, yeah.
Okay. I've never even thought about that, but again, a wonderful record, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm working on one, not for my personal family, but I'm working on a presentation to give here at the library on 8 Civil War veterans. And one of them I ordered his pension records for. And his pension file is over 100 pages in length, all the information in there.
Goodness.
But he had enlisted under an alias. So in his pension file, he has to prove that he is that person that was the alias. Well, there was another man who had the same name that had filed for a pension prior, and he had to prove he wasn't that person.
Wow.
So all that information is in his pension record.
So much story in there. So much story. And that's what we're really here today to talk about, is who are those people behind the records? Who are the people behind the records and behind like the names that appear in the newspaper articles? So yes, you see mentions of people, but they're actually real people just like us who are walking around, like having thoughts in their heads, having emotions, experiencing the world, interacting with others, interacting with the time and the place that they lived. So it's about humanizing them. When we start to dig into the family history, yeah, it might be cool to have some like, oh, they lived through this war, they lived through this historical event, but who was the person really? What were they like? What kind of challenges did they face? Hopes and fears did they have? Or can I guess to what those may have been, based on the time and the place that they lived in? It's starting to get a little bit deeper into the humanity of the history. So that's what we're going to really try to do today. But you know how we get there. We can't just make it all up. To a certain extent we can try to guess things based on the research that we do. But the research is so important to help get us there. The more pieces of the puzzle that we have through the research, the better picture we can paint of the people. That's why the research is so important. And the veterans' records are important. And the newspaper mentions of the people and what they did on a Sunday afternoon. And, you know, they used to print so many more things about people, which makes it fun because we can get more pieces of what they were like that way. But besides newspapers, veterans' records, what other kinds of records can we find that help us paint these people? We talk to ancestors, we talk to people about old family stories and what people were like.
Well, if you can have access to or find old letters.
Ooh, there it is, yeah.
Great.
Anything in their own words would be a gem, an absolute gem. Because then we're really getting inside of their head and their thoughts, their hearts.
And that's the thing with the pension record of this guy, is he had to write his affidavit for it. And so he's describing his own history in his
Yeah.
words.
Anything in their words, you could actually quote from. In a story that you're writing about your ancestors or your family history, you could quote from those things. You know, in a letter that he wrote dated July 4th, 1970, he said, have little excerpts from it. in your history that you're writing. It's an excerpt. Colleen?
A little chunk of, a little piece of.
That's
Is that
right.
what you mean?
So like a passage that you're including from it, you're taking a little chunk of it and putting it in your own writing. Okay, there's so many more resources though, and I know that this group knows some of them. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, you've got your primary documents too. You have your census records, your birth and death certificates, your land records. Sometimes they have land files that, you know, when they filed for their homestead, and they had to prove up in 5 years, they had to kind of give a history of their life on that homestead for 5 years, show that they were there, when they were gone, for how long, that kind of stuff. And it even describes, you know, the building that they built and how many feet and rooms and all that stuff. That has a lot of neat information. But census records, birth certificates, death certificates, you can get information about parents, birthplaces, illnesses, that kind of stuff.
And do you have to traipse down to the local courthouse to get it all?
Mostly not.
Yeah, not anymore.
Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org are the two that.
Find a Grave can be a good website
Yeah.
to start with, just to kind of get some of the
And
initial.
sometimes on Find a Grave, people, and we've covered Find a Grave in a previous meeting we had, and sometimes people will put on their stories, you know, in the narrative about the person, so that's really helpful.
Yeah, so think about all the records that might be available to you. Any public records, census.
One
Birth,
more
death.
place that might be a good place to go is a lot of these counties, communities got together in the late 60s and 70s and put together a history book. And they had their own family histories in there. And so there's a lot of information in there that, you know, from people that have been long gone, you know, the stories that they were told. So
Yeah.
that's been a great resource, you know, for me and stuff.
They're
Yeah.
kind of hard to find though. Do you know what I mean? Some of those books, I mean, if the
Mhm.
library doesn't have them, I mean, they're kind of far few and fetched.
Yeah, you have to read that, look for local churches and that kind of stuff. A lot
Yeah.
of times they'll write their Golden Jubilee
Right,
uh,
right.
history or whatever, so.
I mean, I know it sounds obvious, especially to this group, but it really is going to the local library of the town where the most of your family members lived. Going to the local courthouse, asking people about it.
Yeah.
Do you know these people? Going to the church that they attended, if it's still there. Asking for the, you know, collections, if you have any. It's really knocking on a lot of doors.
And asking relatives that are still alive, like you said before too, sometimes they just want to pass their
Most of
stuff.
my relatives or ancestors are from Italy, so I got a real kick out of finding the manifests and finding their names on the
Yeah.
manifests. That's a real thrill.
You can get the names of all the rest of their family too.
Right, exactly. And how many times they went back and forth.
So think about old Bibles that might have little bits of information tucked in. Think about, I mean, I know that old photo albums can even have like little stories and anecdotes and like old programs from school tucked in. Scrapbooks that you can find, you know, when you're cleaning out older relatives' homes, really think about all the treasures that could be there. Old programs, trying to think of anything else we haven't covered.
If they were public figures, maybe they make speeches too.
Yes,
Really good.
any speeches, let's see. I think we've covered the main ones, but all of these different sources will help you start to, like I said before, piece together the picture of who those people are. If you're interested in where they came from, let's say your relatives came here from Ireland or Italy or whatever country they came from, you can even read a little bit about the history of that place and time that they came from, just in general research books. You know, make yourself a little more educated about the history of the time that they came.
Yeah, and if you know when they came, and you look at the history of where it was they came from, you might get an idea of what caused them to leave that country to come here.
Or at least you can make an educated guess.
Yeah, well, I've got ancestors that came from Ireland in the 1840s, the time of the potato famine.
Right,
So chances are that was the reason they left.
right. Exactly.
Potato famine,
Yeah.
add that to the story.
So I think a lot of times we can, when we're writing, we have to just kind of go along that route of chances are, this is why this happened. To my best guess, this is why they did this. To the best of my ability, this is how this went down. This is why I know this, because I've done the research. I mean, you can't 100% always know, but you can make the best possible guess that you can based on your research.
I lucked out, found an obituary on my second great grandfather, who was a judge in Valentine, Nebraska. And the obituary had lots of detail about his life, you know, growing up in Vermont, coming west early on to Chicago and Minnesota, and into trapping and trading along the Red River, the north, and all this stuff. And then it talked about his Civil War experience and moving west after the Civil War, further west. And I found in some of my grandmother's papers a handwritten document that mirrored that. And it was his memories that he had written for a little biography about himself. So I went through then and I put dates to everything that didn't already have one. It said he'd enlisted in this military unit in Chicago. Well, I looked up when that military unit, you know, was formed and found him in the roster of the military unit, when it was dissolved and what other unit he went to. And then I started pulling up battles that they participated in, and I put a narrative from those battles and stuff. So
Right.
you just fill it out with all that extra background you can find.
Like if you know, I'm just giving a kind of modern example, but if you know that your ancestor or your relative was a motorcycle fan and every year went to the Sturgis rally, you know how to describe the Sturgis rally and what that would have been like? You know what kinds of things that person would have been involved with every day. You know, he would have been cruising down Maine and he would have been going to these restaurants and he maybe saw a concert at this, you know, campground, and maybe he, you know, you kind of know how to describe certain aspects of it just based on what you know. Or you can find out about the place that they're involved with. So we need to think about the people in our past, so our ancestors, but also the places that they inhabited. The places that they inhabited. So people are not just floating around on their own in space, most of us. I mean, astronauts are, but most people, like, they're in a specific location. I guess space is a location too, but you need to learn how the people are interacting with their space and their location. So, let's say your ancestors moved to Sturgis. Well, what was Sturgis like at that year that they moved here? You know, what did Sturgis look like? What were the weather patterns like? Was it the year of the flood? That's a huge indicator of something going on in the environment. So when we're writing our stories, don't just focus on the people, don't just focus on the historical events, focus on the places, what the places looked like. Wow, they moved to the majestic Black Hills. I can describe that, what the Black Hills were like. I can describe the green fields of Ireland. I can describe these places. What it would have looked like to these people. What it would have felt like coming from hot, humid Florida to, you know, dry desert Arizona. I can describe the surroundings and how the people interacted with their environments. So remember, if you kind of forget that people and places are linked. So linked. And it affects a lot about what people do. The place that they live in, the place that they work in, the place that they raise their families in. So try to see if you can make a portrait in your writing of both. Who the people were and the places and how they influenced each other. And Any thoughts on that? Or does that make sense to you? Is there anything else that we might want to think about when we're writing our life stories? People, the places, anything else, any other factors that are linked in there? Yeah, definitely some of those historical events that they lived through, those milestones.
Yeah, if they lived during the time of the Civil War, where did they live?
Yeah.
Did the war have any direct impact on them? Were they near to one of the battlefields?
Exactly.
What did they have, was one of, their friends, or were they, did they lose a sibling
Yeah.
in the war?
Again, people, places, events, so linked. It's like you can't get rid of one. It's like, nope, you're linked. Sorry, you're together for life. You are linked. If you lived right by one of the battlefields, yes, you are gonna have war there in your backyard. Were you in the north, were you in the south, right? All this stuff really goes into our life stories and our recollections of ancestors.
Were you in San Francisco in 1906 when the great earthquake occurred?
Exactly.
You would have experienced that.
Chicago in 1871.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was just thinking, because that's where my ancestors were.
Yes. Can you think of any other big milestones that ancestors would have maybe lived through in your life stories?
Well, the 1918, the Spanish flu.
Yes. Good one.
The Great Depression.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. But again, Great Depression, huge historical milestone, influenced so much by environment for so many people. And the people, what are the people like during that time period? Many of
The politics and the engineering of money and what happened at that time
Yeah.
in the larger picture.
Well, then how did that upbringing influence them even later? I know my grandparents, who were around for the Depression, were very frugal later on. Very frugal. Didn't want to spend a dime because they were so traumatized by living during that time.
I thought a lot about, like my great-grandparents who were raised by Victorian era thinking, and very different, and as time, in human time, it feels like a long time, but in Earth time, that's a hop.
Yeah.
And it was very different morality, very different, women and children's place in history, all of that was very different.
Oh, good point, Colleen. So even just the gender of your ancestor that you're thinking about or writing about, how did their role in society influence the family history? Right? It was very different for women versus men.
Well, even the data you have for women is gonna be harder to find, and even when you find something about one, they're usually listed as Mrs. So-and-so,
Right.
Mrs. John this,
Right, even the way they're referred to.
Yeah.
And I know with some of my ancestors, they came from England, and the class structure,
Oh, yeah.
it was, she married beneath her structure, her class, and so her family was kind of opposed to the marriage.
So think about the roles your ancestors were playing. How did they identify themselves? For many females, it was homemaker, mother, wife, but not always. How did they identify themselves? Was it by their profession? Was it farmer? Was it, I identified myself as a leader in the town. I made a lot of change in that town. I'll read an example from one of my own family histories, but my great-great-great-grandfather was he built a hotel. He was also a lawyer. He was also a politician. And a lot of these small towns, they played all the roles. They wore all the hats. So think about the multiple hats or roles that they may have taken on, too. See if you can identify across the board Where were they involved? Go beyond their profession. What about their hobbies and civic activities too? That they were involved with.
So when you write a family history and you hear all the gossip that took place, you put that in there, a lot of it was probably true, maybe some of it wasn't.
Are you hearing the gossip from other family members, or like, are you talking about
From
gossip?
other family members.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, I think I would definitely include it.
But
Oh,
I
yeah.
would- And I've done this because there have been some really outrageous stories. And so I've gone back, I've taken the story, and then I dissect it
Yeah.
into pieces, you know, where they were and how they were supposed to have behaved and what else was there and all that. And then I try to verify each of those pieces. And usually it falls apart, but you get hints out of that.
Yeah.
And I would include the story and then the actual factual information that you're able to derive from the
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
So, and you may even, yeah, I would include like where it came from too.
yeah. Well, my grandparents in 1951 took a trip, flew to Cuba. And on newspapers.com, I found the passenger list of the plane they were on.
Oh, cool.
And at that time, gambling was wide open in Cuba, just before the revolution. And so my grandmother was very upset when she came back. She bought a lot of nice stuff when she was there, but very upset when she came back. So I'm sure that my grandfather, knowing his history, was down there to participate in gambling
Yes, yeah.
and probably chasing little brown girls.
Oh,
So do you
Yeah.
put that in there?
well,
Doesn't it depend on the intent of your writing?
yes,
You know, who's your audience, what are you trying to do? Because,
yeah.
you know, so much of, you know, without relentless research is, you know, gossip, anecdotal history, and you know, subjective thinking, creative thinking.
I like to say though, I mean, where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Like if there's some gossip or some retelling of a story, it's usually there's some truth there. Like you said, Mark, see if you can locate where the truth is within the story.
My granduncle was a German POW during World War II. I mean, he was a POW of the Germans. He was taken in North Africa with a group of other people from the Sturgis area that were all part of the one-night thing. So there was a whole group of them. And he would tell the most outlandish stories about his time as a POW and escaping and getting taken again and then escaping again and all this stuff. And I didn't know if I could believe it. So I ended up writing a history paper for a college course on him. And I took some of the interviews that he had done with other family members. But then I contacted the families of the other people that were taken with it.
Yeah.
And started researching them and the camp they were supposed to be in and all that. And I ended up finding that most of it was dead on.
Really?
Most of it was dead
Where
on.
there's smoke, there's fire.
Mhm.
Yeah. So let's go to the handout now. I want to give you some tips for how to do the writing now. How to do the writing. So we've talked a little bit about your research methods that you use. Very important to get those sound first. But next, how to actually write this story. So as Colleen mentioned, knowing your audience. Knowing your audience. I think when we start writing, it's always important to know our audience. Who do we plan to write this for? You're gonna write a much different story for a publication, a historical publication, than you would for potentially family members. You might include completely different anecdotes and history. So for family story writing, I would say knowing your audience is incredibly important. Incredibly important. Then I think the other big thing is focusing on writing one ancestor's story at a time. So focus on writing one ancestor's story at a time, or maybe even like one family's story at a time, if you want to take it a step away from that. So maybe you're just focusing on this specific family, not my entire family history. Like one ancestor, or maybe him and his father. Maybe you're just focusing on one or two people at a time. The reason I think that's better is then you can get more focused on that person's story. So, if we're talking about a great-great-grandfather, can I really zero in my research and my story on him? And then maybe eventually get to his lineage from there. But can I identify a few key ancestors that are important to my family history and write their stories? A few key people who really influence the family history. So decide who you want to focus on. Who are the key players in your family history? Who are those key players? And can you write their stories one at a time? Once you decide who those people are, then you need to decide where to start their story, right? Where to start writing their story. So you can either write about it chronologically, like, well, great-great-grandfather was born this year, then in his childhood he did these things, his adulthood he did these things, and then he, came to the US this year. You can kind of go about it chronologically, or you could write a story about that person more anecdotally, by subject matter. Well, he may have several farming anecdotes that you might want to write a story about. He may have been involved in lots of civic activities, and you write one story just about those activities, how he built the town. So the point here is, how can I get it a little more focused? So that it's not just, I'm trying to cram all this history in one long 200-page story. We don't need to do that. We can write several shorter stories about different topics related to that ancestor, or a different story for each ancestor. That way you're really getting into their humanity. Does that make sense? Okay. So discuss your ancestors' challenges and triumphs. We talked a little bit about that. Painting the picture of that person rather than making them just a bunch of statistics that I found in my research. Imagine how your ancestor may have felt. This is a big one. Let yourself jump into them, almost. Jump into their shoes. Jump into their hearts. Imagine how they may have felt. For instance, I can imagine Martha must have felt heartbroken to lose her only child to influenza. We don't know if she felt that way, but we can guess that she maybe did. We don't 100% know. It's okay. We can put ourselves in their shoes and in their hearts and humanize them. I think that's the important thing, humanize them. So other topics we could explore writing about for an ancestor would be social activities, family customs, religion, your ancestor's immigrant story. Wouldn't that be a beautiful story, just to write that short story about their immigrant story? Maybe it's a 4-page story on just that. And then you write another 4-page story about once they got to America and some of the activities they were involved in and how they built up the town. Maybe eventually those stories blend together. But I think if you take it one shorter story at a time, you can focus your mind better and get into that character more.
That's helpful, because, I like to try to encompass it all in one big thing. But you're saying that break it into smaller pieces.
I mean, it sounds like so easy, like when you really think about it. Oh, just write a shorter story, break it down. But it's not. It's not, is it? You have to actively, consciously do it and focus in. Almost like, okay, ancestor, lead me through. Lead me through what it was like for you. I want to feel like I'm there with you. Okay, let me share that, what it would have been like with others then.
I think that it's really easy to get caught up in with the end result. We want the end result, and first drafts are really nice, and then they can be rewritten and added to and deleted from and built upon. But sometimes it's easy to get stuck in, but this is how I want it to go,
Yeah.
instead of letting it happen.
Mhm.
I find, writing, I find that if I don't try and focus too much on beginning, middle, end, sometimes I just start in the middle and then flesh it out.
Yeah. Good point. So how do we start writing? The first thing I would do, under writing the story techniques, develop a timeline of your ancestor's life, highlighting key events and gaps in information. So, timelines are great, especially when we're not considering, oh, it's the whole Robinson family. Think about the ancestor you're focusing on. Can you do a timeline just for that person? And we've talked about this, but imagine yourself in the time and place that your ancestor lived, showing the person in his or her environment. We've talked quite a bit about that. But the next one we haven't talked about, describing your ancestor's physical characteristics and immersing yourself in his or her emotional state. We talked about that. But physical characteristics, how did your ancestor actually look? You've seen photographs. Part of the story is how they looked, how they dressed, how they carried themselves, how they spoke. Like Pauline said, can you find a speech they gave? And even include little snippets of it. How they spoke, how they wrote. Think about everything you notice about a person. How they move, like am I always just like, yeah, how I talk, how I present to the world, like, oh, I'm always angry. So your ancestors' demeanor, it's so much more than just the dates. Think if you can really, if you're zeroing in on just that person, can I find out more about their physical attributes, their emotional attributes? I would say their spiritual attributes. Were they a deeply religious person? Did they always live by certain, philosophies of life? Were they enlightened? Were they simple?
I was watching one of the talk shows the other night, and it was interesting to me. It was he was interviewing Joan Baez, who talked about, as a very young woman, was with Martin Luther King Jr. And we usually have this, really stoic, sacred, wordy man. And he asked her, what was he like, and what's something unexpected? And she kind of chuckled and said, he was really funny. When he wasn't on camera, when he wasn't on film, a whole bunch of those guys from that era, John Lewis and Jesse Jackson, or maybe not Jesse, I don't know, but anyway, Martin and a few others got together, and she expected them to talk all of this, really important movement stuff, and they told jokes all night long.
That's
who
great.
thinks of Martin Luther King joking? I never did. It was just an interesting idea of how the notions that we have about people, and then somebody comes along who says, hey, think again.
Yeah, if it's like a family story that your ancestor was always cracking jokes, that might be really fun to include, especially if there was a joke that was captured.
I have an ancestor my second great-grandfather, who was, technically we'd call it an Indian agent on the Rosebud Reservation. And that's what first brought him to western South Dakota. And he got there in 1890, was there early on. Well, during his time, there was the Wounded Knee incident at the next reservation over. Well, I never really knew what his attitude was toward Indian people. If he was there, we saw himself as a teacher, because he was supposed to be teaching farming and stuff. He was the boss farmer. Or if he saw himself as, turning these people into good Victorian white people, so to speak. And I found a newspaper interview with him. He was on a train coming back from Washington, D.C., and a newspaper reporter from New York was down there and interviewed him. And they were asking questions about the uprising and how if things have settled down and everything. And he started talking, to my disappointment, about how they were gonna turn them into good white men and teach them how to farm the land and calm their base or proclivities and all that stuff, to my disappointment. So sometimes you're gonna find out things that aren't as fun, but
That's a good point.
it was a good indication of his motivations and his views on the world. He was a Victorian, you know.
Mark brings up a good point, though. Accepting how that person was, and really painting that rather than painting the picture you wish they were, or glossing it over. Just a few more here before we're gonna get into some actual writing. So we talked about including quotes from newspapers and other sources to add dimension. We're gonna integrate anecdotes that you can visualize into your story. Anecdote, what is an anecdote?
Offhanded kind of story.
Yeah, basically a little, yeah.
Piece of information, yeah.
So a lot of newspapers will say, yeah, the family went down to eat at this fancy restaurant and they dressed up and they did this. That's an anecdote kind of story. So include anecdotes when possible. Bring them out in your stories. Oh, an anecdote is that they made cookies for the church bazaar and they went over like a hit. I don't know what the story is. But bring it out. Bring out those anecdotes. They are gems.
Your stories that you don't know if they're true or not. But that's not right.
So the last one is, rather than writing, Grandpa Frank was tenacious, show us an example of how he was tenacious. That is an anecdote. Can you find an anecdote of how he was tenacious? He, worked every day so hard, slaving away to get that crop going. Well, yeah, he was tenacious. But how was he? The word how is a key word. I could just say, yeah, she was a nice woman. How was she a nice woman? So show those examples of how the ancestor was the way they were. Oh. The universe agrees with me, like, how were they?
Well said.
Right. So we're gonna talk about actual ancestors, right, today, from our life stories. Make sure we're doing okay on time. Okay, perfect. So on a piece of paper that you have, I think you all have paper, right?
Here if you need some.
Okay. So on your piece of paper, I want you to just draw a quick horizontal line, which is going to be your timeline. Horizontal line. Horizontal, the paper goes this way. So like a horizontal line. You'll just draw a line across your paper. And then I want you to think about an ancestor from your family history that you think you know a little bit about. You think you know a little bit about that person. And I want you to start doing, just right here, right now, you're not going to be able to consult your research, but based on your memories of what you've looked up so far, a basic timeline of milestones or anecdotes about this person that you know. This does not have to be something profound. It can just be a timeline of basic little things that this ancestor did, that this ancestor won an award, that this ancestor, started the farm, that this ancestor built the hotel, that this ancestor, lost a child. It can be profound, it can be not profound. Whatever is coming to you right now. I'll give you a few minutes.
This is tough for me, Molly, because I've been doing research on the 8 guys in the picture that I'm doing the presentation on. So I haven't been doing a lot of my own family research, so I'm trying to.
Well, who are the 8 guys in the presentation?
There are 8 Civil War veterans that lived here in Sturgis and are buried.
Pick one of them.
Well, I did.
Okay.
I'll do my own,
Yeah.
but, because those guys are working on it. Some of them are quite very interesting
Oh, I bet.
stories.
I bet.
So,
Remember, the more specific you can get, the better. All right, how are those timelines coming? Good? Do you have a few notches down on the timeline? Okay,
I don't know when stuff happened.
that's okay. That's okay. You don't have to have years.
That's good.
Right now, anyway, yeah, I mean, this is just brainstorming. So, we're just gonna stop there for now, because you could go on with the timeline for hours. And I think you should, if you enjoy kind of trying to come up with the brainstorming parts and organize it into a sort of timeline. Do this later on your own. So any things that really came to you on your timeline, any things that stood out, like, wow, this was cool that I remembered this.
I wrote a timeline for my grandpa. And figured out I don't know that much about his life.
Ooh.
I know some key things. It is up when he came to US, when he was born, came to US, and all those things. But then after, other than getting married and having kids, there's a long gap till, and then he retired from farming and then he died. There's
It's
a long gap in
interesting.
there. And
It's
I'm
happening.
like, I heard my mom and aunt tell stories about all kinds of things in there. But I don't know when they happened. I don't know
Yeah.
when their house was destroyed by the tornado. I don't know any of those things.
Right.
And that's all important stuff about his life that I don't know.
I
So
like
I'm
that.
having dinner with my mom and aunt here after we're done, and I've been asking questions, so I
Love
didn't
that.
know it. I know more about old-time ancestors than I do about my grandpa, who I knew.
I love the, like, realization of that, and the honesty, and the, yeah, there's some that I know, but there's more that I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, that's how I felt too. I was kind of going through, my great-grandfather who, I don't know, lived in Creek City and, you know, with all of the gold mine and all that kind of stuff too, but, yeah, there's like lots of gaps. And I was like, oh my goodness, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the same way with Mark. I was doing my grandfather. And I know the dates of, when he got married, when he came to this country, and
Uh-huh.
when he had children. But after his last child was born, which was my father, up until he passed away, I don't know really anything.
You know?
And unfortunately, I have no one to ask, because all my aunts and uncles on that side of the family have all passed away.
You know, that's why this method can also be helpful, though. Writing an anecdote or a couple anecdotes about the ancestor that you do know. Because you maybe don't know their whole story. That's why you want to focus on the real things that you do know and flush those out, because you're essentially leaving that piece of family history too, and making it so that that isn't lost, even what is known right now. And it gives, like Mark's saying, gives you an idea of what you still kind of need to fill in if you're interested in doing so. Like, wow, I need to talk to these people while they're still alive. My husband's father is from Iran, and he died a couple of years ago, and I've always had it on my list, like, oh, talk to Assad about stories from Iran. Did I ever do it? Not enough. I mean, before he died, because he died unexpectedly. But I wish I would have actually recorded some of those stories before he died. So this could give you an idea of kind of where you need to fill in, who you need to talk to, but also some of what you already know, and things that could come out if you're writing a story about a specific ancestor.
That's something with my grandfather. He had a daughter that died just before my dad was born. She was about 3, but she's not recorded in any of the family histories. but I know about her from stories that my dad told me about, and that he remembered his siblings talking about. And I know where she's buried. She's buried in the same cemetery as my grandparents are. But as far as the family history, she's just kind of forgotten about it because she died as a 3-year-old.
I would say the job of a writer is to capture some of those things. Like, the job of a writer is to pass along stories, to pass along some of the maybe even forgotten.
And then there's another one that's recorded, that they had a son that died in 1910. And his headstone just is labeled infant son of Charles Stroschein. No name or anything, just the date of 1910. And I've never researched it a lot, but as far as, you know, how long was it, just, you know, died the same day he was born, or what?
So getting some of these down onto paper is so important for those reasons. Otherwise, she may be forgotten. I heard an interesting commercial even before I came over here. I was watching the news, and there was a commercial about the Native American tradition of storytelling and how that really is so essential to them. Like, the act of storytelling is passing along their heritage. They are sharing their history, their ancestry, through the act of verbal storytelling a lot, singing, different things like that. So they were saying, don't smoke tobacco because you'll lose your voice and your ability to pass on your heritage and your ancestry. It was a tobacco commercial, an anti-tobacco, because they were saying you don't want to lose your voice. Because that's how you pass along our ancestry.
That's pretty smart marketing,
Yeah.
really.
But it was so profound to me because for a writer, your voice is through the craft of writing. Don't lose your voice. Don't get, so trapped in it has to be perfect. No, just get some of the stories down. That's the way that they're passed along.
A couple of mine I already knew, but a couple of them I was in Wisconsin about a dozen years ago. And in conversation with my cousins, I heard a couple other stories that I'd never heard. One involving a shotgun that I happened to have passed down from that ancestor. So I just realized that if I hadn't gone to Wisconsin, I would never have known those.
Oh, I love that you brought up the gun, only because think about the artifacts you have in your home as well. The artifacts, like even pieces of jewelry, furniture, they can inspire a story though, of where that came from. And it can be the story of how I got that, who owned it before me, which ancestor had it, how they used it. Could be a way to organize a story.
I have a box in the house with our family history, tree stuff. I have shelves of it, and bins. And my wife hates the box. And I got it in my grandmother's stuff. And in the late Victorian times, they'd grow kids' hair long until they got to a certain age. Then the boys, they'd cut their hair short. The girls, they'd style it and cut it. It's a box from the first haircut of my grandmother and her brother, and it's just a box for the hair.
Wow.
I don't know what to do with it. I don't want to get rid of it. My wife hates it. She thinks it's like haunted or something, so anyway.
Oh,
Maybe have it braided,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's just braided, that's what
then you can hang it on the wall.
Oh, yeah, she'd love that.
but
That's funny, because I just want to tell you guys some stuff from my dad, when he was, going through some stuff, and he gave me this, it's like a rawhide something or other that comes with ropes that somebody gave him when he was like 17 years old, and him and his nephew that are real close in age and he sat there and told me the whole story behind it, and so I sat there and I wrote it all down, and he gave it to me and I was like, oh, now I know. Well, and he's like, he told me the name of this person and just rattled it right off like a, you know what I mean? And he goes, yeah, he was an old bachelor over here. In those books that you were talking about, I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta look this name up to see if I can just come by it. And it was in there and he talked about those things. And
That's great.
I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, and I was like, just the how it all fit together, first of all, and just how, like, he just, you know, my dad's like 83, and he just, you know, was sitting there telling me, and I just, you know.
I love that you wrote it though.
Oh, yeah, I wrote it right away, because I said, if I didn't do that, I'd never remember. That was the big thing, and yeah.
I have one that I need to write down about my parents when they first met. They were 10 years difference in age. My dad was 10 years older than my mom. And my mom was 16 and convinced her parents to let her go to a dance with her older brother. And she wanted to, and they finally let her go. And my mom was there talking with a friend of hers, and this cowboy comes in with this big black cowboy hat on. And my mom says to her friend, that's the guy I'm gonna marry. That was my father. I still have the hat.
So you need to write that story.
Yes.
Exactly as you shared it with us.
Yeah.
Because it paints so many visuals.
Yeah.
And like I said, what were they wearing? The hats.
Yeah.
How old were they? What did they look like? You know,
Yeah.
you go into the, exactly how you told us, you
Yeah.
need to write it.
Yeah. I'm
Well-
just thinking of it here. I'm like, I need to write that story
Short
down.
stories
Yeah.
about an ancestor.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Oh, you know,
And what do you do with all of this?
I have seen,
That's where I get up against a brick wall. I just don't know what to do with all the story. Where do I put them?
Yeah.
Do I put them in the software somehow? I don't know.
Well, I think it's gonna be different for everybody, first of all, how you choose to organize them. But personally, I like the idea of taking all these short stories and putting them into like a really heavy-duty binder and printing them and just having a series of the stories about the ancestor. And then on the front, you know, like how it's clear on a lot of those binders where you can slip something in the
Yeah.
front. I would say the stories of whatever his name is or her name. Or
that's
this
what I
set-
do with mine. I have mine in a binder.
Yeah.
You know,
All
I
the stories together.
Yeah, yep, and I do that. And I just, yep,
Or,
personally, that's how I have
I
mine.
mean, you could get fancy and have them just like bound into a book, but you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. And you could just have them living on your computer somewhere in a document all together. But I would actually prefer that you have them printed
Sure.
and in one place together. Like the story of the hair, that's gotta be in there. The story of I know I'm gonna marry this person. All those stories, you just collect them all, and maybe eventually you find themes. Like, oh, there's gonna be a chapter. This whole chapter is about these kinds of stories. You could put little dividers in there, but you don't have to. The key is they're all in one place. And people know where they are. Or you make copies of them. Like, what I love about the binder too is you can make another binder for, a daughter. You have one, they have one. You can make another binder for someone else. It's not super expensive to do the printing and to get the binders.
And they're always easy to add to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just a quick, like, even if it's just a couple page thing, just.
I love the binders because they really are affordable compared with other sort of publishing options. So just something to consider. At the very least, have a folder on your computer though, where all the stories are stored, and have it clearly labeled so that they're all together. Have them typed up.
I'm a total fan of on the computer and on paper somewhere, because if the computer crashes,
I've had
See,
that
that's
happen.
me. That's why I don't
I,
like to leave them on the computer, because if they do crash, I mean, yeah, you
Well,
can
that's
have.
why we've talked about this too, like last meeting we had, we were talking about scanning and your photos and stuff. You've got to preserve those originals and put them in, some marketable, safe way.
This is why I like this, someone else has a copy. More than one person has a copy, because what if your house burns down?
Right.
Then the daughter has a copy, the son has a copy, someone else has a copy. Someone in the family has a copy.
Saving it to a cloud.
Saving it
Yes.
to a thumb
And to a
drive.
hard drive, and to a
Yeah.
thumb, you know, multiple ways, so.
I mean, the key is have multiple copies
Mhm.
somewhere circulating. Okay, so we're gonna go on to our blue paper. In the middle of the blue paper, I want you to draw a circle. And you're gonna put your ancestor that you're thinking about today and working on, put their name in the middle. Grandpa, Grandpa Frank, whatever the name is.
Not their legal name,
What?
not their legal name, just your familiar name.
Yeah, whatever it is that you want to put as their name. And then I want you to like kind of branch out like this. If you can all see this. What we're doing is we're going to brainstorm some of their physical characteristics, okay? So, okay, Grandpa Frank was tall. So like I might write tall as one in my bubble. But we're going to keep branching out, like spoke softly, joked a lot, whatever they are, okay? Whatever the characteristics are. You're just going to keep going around. It's called a bubble graph. And you're going to build a picture of what this person was like. How did they dress? How did they look? Maybe where did they live? Always lived on farms. Just anything that physically describes them, or maybe just describes them, that can help you paint a picture of that person. This is what we call some of the brainstorming work before we write. Think about the quirky things that made that person that person. Like always listen to jazz music. Always polka danced every night. Always read the Bible. Wouldn't eat peas. Allergic to bees. Politically very conservative. Stuttered. Anything you can think of that describes that person. Covered in tattoos. And when you don't know much, think about the basics. Were they quiet? Were they loud? Outgoing? Were they reserved? Always had a bit of wisdom to share. Strong faith. Lack of faith. Maybe anything like that. Getting to know your ancestor. Never wore a wedding ring. Some of those quirky things. But was married 5 times. Sometimes it's really hard to know these things too. So if you find yourself stumped, just see what you can get. All right, that's enough brainstorming time. Ideally, if we had another hour, what I would have you do is turn over your paper, and I think you should just do this right now, and just put a circle there. So just go ahead and do this now. Turn over your paper, put a circle there, and I want you to put the main location that you associate with your ancestor. So was it Sturgis, South Dakota? And put that in the bubble. And then I just want you to, just for a minute, a few things that describe the place that the ancestor primarily lived. So is it a dry climate? Was it, like they lived there during the flood of 1972? Like maybe that's something to associate with the place. Maybe the place was a small rural town where everyone was close-knit. Just any sort of like a few little bubbles you can describe about the place that they lived. And I really hope that you'll do more bubbles later on the place and the person, because you can do more later. But just anything that comes to mind about the primary place that you associate with a person. And there might be more than one place, so you could do this for multiple places where they were, but we'll just focus on one for now.
This is easier than the person, because I've been here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but think about how the place, what was important about the place though. Not just anything about the place, but you know, what was important about the place as it relates to the person and your story. Like for me, if I had Rapid City, South Dakota on here, I would have like majestic black hills, because when I moved here, that's what kept me here. I'm not from here, but that's what kept me here, is the ability to go in the hills anytime I wanted. Like I love the Black Hills, so that would be on my list, because that was part of my story. So think about it in relation to your ancestors' story. What's important about the place? All right, I'm going to stop you there. I want you to keep doing that on your own time later. Do it for every place, every ancestor. It helps you paint the picture of the person, of the place. Now we're going to do the writing. We're going to tie it all together. Here are a few examples that I want to share with you so you know what we're going for. Story time. So, these examples come from my own family story. I didn't write these, my mom did. She's the real genealogist in our family. But, so this is about her great-great-grandfather. No, her great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. So, above the front desk in the hotel lobby hung an old portrait I recognized at once as my great-grandfather. He must have been 70 when he sat for the photograph. Clad in a dark suit, white shirt, and patterned tie, he looked the consummate professional. Thick white hair swept his broad forehead. Upon the bridge of his nose perched a pair of round wire spectacles. A salt and pepper mustache obscured the top lip of his mouth, drawn and unsmiling. His square jaw, slightly jutting, bespoke determination, though he had a look of growing world-weary. It was his eyes that arrested me. They were inflected with every triumph and tragedy he'd ever experienced. They told of a man who had dreamed big, suffered greatly, grown wise. So just descriptive about the ancestor. Another one. So he spent every spare moment at his 160-acre ranch, building a house erecting fences, cultivating crops, planting orchards, and tending his livestock. Here at last was the land his forebears had only dreamed of. As he took in the scents of wild roses and clover, his eyes sought the horizon, and where the ground met the sky, he could almost see Ireland. All right, your turn. Your turn to write. Can you write a couple paragraphs that really show us your ancestor in a specific setting, in a specific anecdote maybe? Can you really focus in on that ancestor? Maybe just focus on what you think they looked like and where they lived. Maybe focus on a certain historical thing they were part of. Whatever it is, I want it to be very focused on that person. So, do your best. Give us a paragraph or two, and then we'll share some of these. Okay? So, quiet writing time. It doesn't have to be like this, just examples for you to go from. Do your best. Have fun with it, because you can right now. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, just getting stories down on paper. Have fun with this. Go there. Be with your ancestor. Let them guide you. Don't be afraid to guess at a few things, too. All right, I'm going to take a couple more minutes and really flush this out. Go back through and see where you can even add more detail. Couple more minutes here. Give it one more look. See where you can add even more detail. Even a word can make all the difference. All right, so finish up the sentence you're on. We're going to share a few of these now. See what you came up with. So that was 11 minutes of writing time. That's what about 11 minutes feels like. Sometimes it feels like it goes by quickly. Sometimes it feels like the longest 11 minutes in the world. That's what we call in my classes, but in share time. Focused, in the chair, doing the actual writing. That's what it takes to get some of these down onto paper so that they don't just exist here or here telling the stories. It takes the but in share time to actually get it onto the paper. Even if it's only the first draft, even if it's only a few paragraphs of the story, it has to start somewhere, right? It has to start somewhere. So that's what about 11, 12 minutes of writing time looks like. And you can get a lot onto paper in 11 or 12 minutes. Even if you set a timer and decide to work on your ancestor stories for that much time each day, that can make a big difference in getting that whole binder of stories collected. So I highly recommend doing that, or doing it at least once a week. Challenge yourself, see if you can go for 15 minutes. See if you can add even 1 or 2 more details. Like I said, sometimes it's the one word that makes all the difference. Like when I said he never wore a wedding ring, but he was married 5 times. Like that made the story different. So see what makes your story even better or different. You're always like thinking, what else makes this story the full story? How can I more fully tell this story? Okay, so did anyone want to share what they came up with today? Even better if you stand up and read. I've had so many workshops lately, this is unfortunate, where people have told me I couldn't hear the person reading. So I don't want to have that problem today. So, when you do read your story, I want you to stand up here and act like you are presenting. Does anyone want to stand up and read? Okay. There's nothing to be shy about. So. Go ahead.
Do I have to stand up in the front or can
You
I
don't.
stand
You
here?
can just
where-
stand at your
Stand
spot.
here in the corner? As long as the camera gets it. Oh, no.
Yeah, and you are being recorded. I do want to
Yeah.
let you know, this presentation is being recorded today for some group members who couldn't make it. So if you don't feel comfortable sharing in front of a recording, that is completely fine.
Charles was a farmer who lived in a brick house with his wife and 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Charles was born in Germany and had immigrated to the United States when he was 9. His family first settled in Boston. Why Boston? No idea. And then had moved to rural Wisconsin. The house that they lived in was a 2-story and was on a dead-end road. It was surrounded by farmland and rolling hills. His first son had died and was buried in the nearby small town. Charles either didn't know how to spell his own last name or had issues with creditors. There are numerous IOUs that have his signature with his name spelled at least 3 different ways. Maybe the financial issues had to do with the alcoholism he had, according to his daughters. The daughters also tell that when the family moved from Wisconsin to South Dakota, they left in the middle of the night.
Wow. Good job. Lots of good detail in there. What stood out to us in the story? We like to just kind of give a quick feedback to our author.
I liked the chronological order of it, but that personal details were added about the 2-story house, the potential for maybe being an alcoholic and some of those kind of things. It was nice.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a litany of facts, you know.
Exactly. I like that the facts were there, but they were built upon by more personal detail and description.
I like this sense of mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's very
Yeah.
engaging.
That was good.
Very good job. Where could he expand in the story if he could find out more information? Or what did you want to know more about?
The spelling of the 3 names.
Yeah. That baffles me because I've seen the IOUs with his name spelled differently. And it's like, okay, what's the reason behind it?
And I like that, I mean, you can sort of guess to it. You might not ever fully
Yeah.
know.
He maybe knew how to sign his name, maybe he wasn't fully literate.
Mhm.
And, you know,
Yeah.
didn't have a consistent spelling. as you
Right.
realize.
I thought you did a good job of saying like, why? I don't know. I mean, there was like a very conversational tone to your writing that I liked. And I liked that the daughters say this, like you included kind of some other sources in there, but it was very smooth the way it flowed into the narrative. Anything else we want to highlight? Just good job.
Yeah.
Keep writing these little anecdotes and these little stories about ancestors. And see, maybe circle the areas. Where could I expand here? Maybe circle the areas that you might want to try to dig into a little bit more and find out more about. Then you could have even more in there. Anyone else want to go? All right, stand on up. Oh, do you want to come over here so the camera catches you? Just right over here. Just go on up to the front. Go ahead.
Wanting to back up so it can
This,
rest, but give something.
This is basically a kind of an introduction to my grandfather, Eric Pike, and he passed away back in 68, I believe.
1969.
69, okay. Got my wife here to help me out. So, and this is kind of a short paragraph. There's always a lot of room for more adjectives and descriptions. Eric was always an old guy to me. He didn't want his sons to refer to him as the old man, so they called him the old gent, which was short for the old gentleman. Everyone who knew him in the area called him by that name. He was probably about 6'4" with a slight belly, huge hands, and terribly strong handshake. It's said that he could lift a 50-gallon barrel off the ground and put it into the back of a wagon. He liked his old crow, but I never saw him actually looking like he was drunk. He was a happy drinker and always a productive person, no matter what no matter how much old crow he had, which I never really noticed him as a child. The family doctor, Joseph Ham, said that probably kept him alive until he was 84 because he had a very enlarged heart. I knew him as very generous and willing to teach, and like any story, I go through it and I write a sentence out, and then I can go through and add a whole nother sentence of description to go along with it. So,
Yeah,
short paragraph.
good job. So what did we learn about Eric? Oh, I'm just asking the group, what did we learn about Eric? The ancestors,
It
Eric,
seemed
right?
like he was well regarded, you know, because the old gentleman is kind of a lovely, respectful way to refer to
Yeah.
somebody.
I love that. I love that you have that he liked to be referred to as the old gents.
Yeah,
That's cool, that's a good detail.
yeah.
The physical description of him too, I couldn't help but notice the similarities, the height, the strength, the build,
Yeah, good
And
physical
he
description.
also, and he wore suspenders, and so those are more descriptive adjectives that you could add as you go along. And typically I'll write something out, and no matter what it is, go back the next day and read it and think, why did I say it that way, and what could I add?
Right.
So,
That's the process, right?
yeah.
When we write something the first time, I'd say 100% of the time, there's always places we could add more. But there's always a stopping point too. At some point, just, okay, I can stop.
Yeah.
But usually there's places we can add more, but I thought you got a lot of good stuff down onto paper.
Yeah.
A lot of good detail. Anything else that stood out to the group? Or things you wanted to know more about the ancestor?
I liked that you were able to name his doctor. And
Yeah.
some neighbors and those kind of things, people that were involved in his life.
What an obscure thing to say too by a doctor, that was really interesting to me,
Yeah.
that, the drinking probably kept him alive. Bless
Yeah.
his heart. That was very interesting.
Again, some of those unique things can be the best things to mention. Those unique or sort of quirky things about people, or, things people said about your ancestor can be the most interesting things to read. They make us human. Yeah, it reminded me of something that happened in my own life where I was out on St. Patrick's Day, the evening before. I had a massive blood clot in my right leg, and my doctor said it's probably good that you were out drinking the night before because it really kept your blood thinner. Like that kind of a comment.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's just those types of things that are just like, what? Like, yeah, it's probably good that you were out getting drunk on St. Patrick's Day. Like that kind of thing. It probably kept you alive. But just those little quirky tidbits that we pick up. All right, who's next?
I'll go.
Okay.
My Arapaho dad had a white woman great-great-grandmother who was adopted by the tribe after being captured during the Indian Wars. The tribe had been divided after the Sand Creek Massacre, and half were marched to Oklahoma, our half were marched to Wyoming to to share the Wind River Reservation, which had been granted to the Shoshones during some treaty arrangement. While the Shoshones agreed to accommodate the Northern Arapaho, they still regarded each other as traditional enemies, which complicated life and relationships to this day. Lizzie Fletcher refused to return to white civilization, preferring to remain enveloped in the culture of her adopted family, living a life on the high desert land, loved by her Arapaho relatives and despised by the ever-expanding white dominating people. "She reminds me of you," he said, "white squaw," he called me with a smile, and not a trace of the politically incorrect thought of squaw, which was hated by the young natives my age. We were chatting while I practiced cutting long strips of meat for drying, much like Grandma Lizzie had done all of her adult life.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, what did we like about the story? What stood out?
I like the conflict between cultures, you know, and it was really obvious, not just the white and native cultures, but the Arapaho and, you know, Shoshone, I believe he said, cultures and, you know, sharing space. But, you know, obviously it wasn't a fully comfortable situation.
And you could almost see her cutting the strips of meat.
Yeah.
It was very vivid.
I'm really in it. I mean, she drew you in right away.
It's all about the painting.
Mm-hmm.
I say this a lot, but writers, you are artists. It's hard to sometimes, you know, see yourself that way. I'm an artist because I suck at painting, but I am with my words. It's creating the pictures. Like you said, you could see the strips of meat being cut. That's a picture that she painted. And I like how you were like her in that moment. Like Grandma Lizzie, right? Anything else that we liked about the story? Or that you wanted to know more about?
How about a story about you? Do you teach? Where are you from? Where did you go to school?
Story about me? No. Any more about Colleen's story that you wanted to know more about?
I liked, you know, the references to different things, you know, talking about the Sand Creek Massacre and the division of the Arapaho. There's all kinds of avenues you can follow there. You know, there's a lot of different pathways available, and those kind of things.
Yeah, I remembered when sitting down with the family and drawing out, you know, from where the old chiefs were, where Lizzie was, and where we were at that time, and I had it written down. I hadn't thought about it for a long time, but I would like to continue this. And there's a lot of, you know, like, I mean, you know, I know what they told me, but I don't know what happened. There's no way to check what happened, and almost everybody's dead now that from that time.
Very special story though.
Yeah.
And that one might be one where you have to guess a lot. Because most of them are
Yeah.
dead. But to your best guess,
Yeah.
based on what you've heard and collected over the years.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. Yeah, one more, and then we'll wrap up. And I'll share a few words about myself at the end, but does one more person want to share?
I can share.
Okay, Mark.
I'll share. I shared too much. I was trying to let somebody else share. I was kind of inspired by your mother's first story you read, because it was just focused on a photograph. You know, the entire thing was descriptive personality about a photograph, and it got me thinking about my grandfather, who I've been using as my template here, and a photograph that I have of him. So I just said the photo of Matt Kuntz shows a strong and steady man beyond his prime, but with a lot of good years still ahead of him. He had foregone his usual farm work clothes and hat for fancier clothing, wearing a nice suit and tie and sporting a clean fedora on his head. The hat covered his short, practical hair, which was wavy and almost completely white. His hair had changed quickly in his late 50s from its original thick, wavy brown to snow white. Matt's holding a nearly ever-present cigarette, his only true vice based on our current standards. He isn't smiling, but rather has a slight scowl on his face and squinting eyes due to the placement of the sun. However, Matt was known to joke and tell stories with people he knew.
All right, what do we like? What stood out about the ancestor?
You pretty much know what he looked like.
Yeah. So much good physical description. I think whenever possible, it just adds so much to the story to get that physical description in there. Like, the most that we can know about the person's description. If you've seen photographs, I mean, you can try to paint the picture of the person. I thought that was great, though. Just the way the hair was changing, the focus on the hair was good. It's all in the little details.
And that idea of a practical life and a kind of gussied up
Yeah.
presentation, I like that.
And the photograph route's definitely a route you can go.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just seeing this photograph and describing the photograph and then sharing a little bit more about the person's story from there. That's a way you could kind of frame the story. Yeah, it makes me wonder, Colleen, do you know any more about what Lizzie looked like?
Yeah, I know what they told me, you know, that she was very, very fair, and they would, you know, like, she wore like, because they were trading, you know, so she wore cloth clothes, and she, you know, she would carry a knife and an awl to work on things, and headscarves, stuff like that, like how the older ladies did.
Yeah, I think some of that detail would be really good.
Yeah,
To include.
it was really fun. I hadn't thought about that in a long time.
Yeah. Mark, you did so well weaving in that detail. Any other thoughts on Mark's story?
Yes, good. And you know, thinking of the picture, like you said too, I think that's a really good idea to kind of focus in on details.
Anything else you wanted to know about Mark's ancestor, or places he could expand? What was his name again?
Matt.
Matt, yes. Matthias. Did he go by Matthias?
Matt.
He went by Matt. Okay. Anything else you want to know about Matt?
Why was he dressed up?
Oh, about Matt, his
Oh, about
ancestor.
Yes,
He
they
just
were-
wants to know about me.
Yes, and they were probably headed to church or something,
Or
there were
like-
kids, he was next to the car and there were kids in the car,
Yeah.
you know, so.
Yeah.
Nice.
I mean, you could always just even speculate more.
Mhm.
You can always speculate more in these stories, and I think that's something, give yourself permission to do that. It kind of feels uncomfortable, because I don't know for sure, but when you're saying, you know, I could guess that they were on their way to church, then you're saying that's me guessing. Not that they were 100% doing it, but it kind of adds to the story when you can do that. So, any final questions, comments about today's workshop? We are reaching the end, so anything you want to take with you today as you work on your stories about your family histories? Oh, good.
It was so good.
Good, thank you. Good. I hope that you'll take something with you and actually apply it as you're doing your research and writing about your ancestors. Remember, the more you can humanize them, the better. And the other key, people and places are linked. So think about the places where they lived, where they worked. It'll give you so many hints about what's going on with your ancestor. And about me, I do these workshops all the time in Rapid City through the Humanities Council and through just my own independent means. So I teach life story writing workshops, and I kind of have various offshoot type of workshops from that. So one of the offshoot workshops that I do is this ancestor writing, genealogy writing workshop. And then I also offer an obituary writing workshop, so how to write your own obituary. And then
That's
I
a fun
have,
one, actually.
yeah. Then I do a lot of creative life story writing workshops. So if you want to join my email list, you certainly can, and I will send you notices about upcoming workshops going on. So if you want to join it, I can just pass along this paper and you can write your email down if you're no longer on my, or if you're not yet on my list.
So you just want the email address?
Yeah.
Or just,
I don't call people personally anymore, so if you're not on my email list, I'm sorry.
You're so modern.
I know. I just can't. I can't call everyone. But that is, I'd love to see more of you at my workshops. They're usually in Rapid City, but I've been all over the hills. I go to Custer sometimes, I go to Piedmont, I go to Keystone, I come here sometimes.
Where's you at in Rapid?
Spearfish. Where am I at?
In Rapid?
So in Rapid City, I've been at Minaloosahan Senior Center. I've been at the library. In fact, I have one coming up at the Rapid City Library June 3rd. And that one's going to be more of a creative story writing workshop. So it really depends, and I'll keep you posted if you join my email list.
I know you have one you're gonna be doing with the Alzheimer's group that meets at
Yeah,
Luzon.
yes. That one's going to be more for caregivers of people with dementia and helping them start to write some of their memories down. So that one's going to be pretty specific. But, there's so much power in getting these stories down that I like to help people do that in any way that I can. So if you're with another organization that needs a, workshop, consider this type of thing. And you can always do that through the Humanities Council. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.